Hi everyone, welcome to Medieval England. Let's get started. Okay, today's lecture, The Troubled Reign of Henry III, Monarchy, Community, and Parliament. The goals for today's lecture are to present the story of Henry III's reign from minority council, personal rule, baronial, reform period, and back to personal rule. And by the end of the lecture, you should be able to explain how factionalism, failed wars, and costly concessions, such as debts, in Henry III's reign led to provisional government takeover, and what new distinguishing feature of constitutional history of England happened during Henry III's reign. And lastly, you should be able to explain Jewish treatment under Henry III. We begin with the minority rule under William Marshall. This goes from 1217 up to 1234 under Peter de Roche. And then we move into the personal rule of Henry III, the baronial reform, council, and rebellion from 1258. And then Henry resumes the throne again in 1256. When King John died on October 19th, 1216, he had reneged on Magna Carta, and the Pope had annulled it, claiming that it had been extracted by force. Portions of England were in active rebellion, some of whom supported Prince Louis, the son of King Philip of France, who declared himself to be the rightful king of England. 9 days after the death of John, Henry III was crowned, and he was the first child to inherit the English throne since Ethelred the Unready in 987. John's death was a blessing because it gave supporters a chance to end the Civil War through a new negotiated political agreement. When Henry was crowned on October 28th, he was flanked by supporters such as William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, who would be destined to play a very important role in the minority rule. Henry was only 9 years old, and so this begins that minority rule, which was really controlled by magnates such as William. 1 month later, this minority administration issued a revised version of Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and this was led by William Marshall and the papal legate Gaula. This was meant to unite the loyalists, those committed to John's legacy, as well as the rebellion, as those in rebellion. It was revised in that many sweeping restrictions of the 1215 Charter on the king were removed. For example, the requirement that subjects have to give consent before he could levy aids and scutages. Now note, this is a huge concession. People are giving up the right of consent that they had seemed so important in 1215. But the fundamental claim of 1215, that the king should rule in accordance with the laws and customs of the land, and that the king's justice should be available equally to all free men, survives intact in the 1216 reissue. Now, despite the 1216 reissue, many rebels continued to oppose the minority government. But in spring of 1217, they were crushed at the Battle of Lincoln. The victors, under William Marshall, issued yet again another version of the Magna Carta in 1217. So here we get a sense that Magna Carta wasn't simply a ploy. It was, in fact, a central document for trying to move forward under the provisional government. Now, this version of the 1217 version also contained provisions restricting the king's arbitrary authority to establish forest boundaries and to regulate forest lands. This is significant because from this point on in English history, when the demands for a reconfirmation of the Magna Carta were called for, it was always the 1217 version that was met. So it's really this version that is most significant rather than the 1215 version. Now, legally, the kingdom belonged to the papacy under the guardianship of the Pope because John had promised it to Innocent. In reality, it was ruled by a minority council. The minority council was composed of earls and bishops who provided a degree of consultation and consent for the new government's policies. The greatest of these was Earl Marshall. William reinstituted administrators such as the justiciar Herbert de Burgh. De Burgh initiated new kingdom-wide visitations by itinerant justices. This is circuit justices, as we've seen before. This was important because of the many legal cases during the Civil War and also to generate cash for the new administration. We've seen this a number of times before. What follows a long period of civil war is a whole slew of cases over who owns what property, and this is always the first order of business post a civil war. There was also reinstituted the Exchequer, who had gone away, and this was the young king's personal guardian, Peter de Roche, who was the Bishop of Winchester. The Exchequer, which had ceased in 1215, now starts up again and initiates a series of audits and enrolls and collects the king's revenue. And also a series of new royal justices were appointed in 1218. We have a source on this, Henry de Bracton's notebook, The Case from the Royal Courts. The rebels retreated in a kind way, as it were. Despite the royalist victory, Marshall's government did not attempt any significant confiscations or reallocations. So rather than crush the rebels, now that they had won, the loyalists attempted to fold them back into a functioning society. The rebels were allowed to return to their estates. William Marshall died in 1219, and control of the council fell to Herbert de Burgh. We get a sense of de Burgh's rule with an important tax that he raised in 1225. De Burgh persuaded the great council of earls and barons to grant the king a voluntary tax, 1/5 of the value of all movable property, in return for the king's promise to reconfirm and reissue yet again Magna Carta in 1225. Why reissue Magna Carta yet again in 1225? Well, this time it would be in the name of the king, King Henry, rather than in the name of the minority government. All movable property included all goods that people intended to sell, rents, and other types of cash. That is to say, not seed or farming implements or animals. This money went ultimately to a futile effort to recapture the province of Poitou. This precedent signals a new reality. De Burgh made it clear that he would only request voluntary taxes in exchange for political gestures or concessions, such as the reissuing of a charter. So not forced taxes here, but a negotiated voluntary taxation. Thus, the negotiations of 1225 over taxation set a precedent for English politics for the whole of the 13th century. We've got voluntary taxation in exchange for political concessions. This is going to be important. All right, well, let's pause the narrative and drive this point home. If you were here with me, we would engage in a discussion, but since you're not, I'm just going to discuss this by myself. What's going on here with Magna Carta? We've seen that the statutes requiring consent for taxation were removed from the later versions of Magna Carta, the 1216 and also the 1217. But does that mean that leaders such as de Burgh wanted to tax without consent? Well, no, I just said that. But what does this mean? Was Magna Carta really central or ideal for English magnates? Not really. For medieval magnates, they were forced rather by terrible kings into a document such as Magna Carta. These documents are really too binding, and they avoid the type of honorable harmony of an ideal relationship that everybody wanted. They wanted something more human, something more relational, and less binding. We might think of the constitutions of Clarendon that we've already discussed as a parallel example. Becket was willing to help Henry, but when Henry forced him to be bound by a limited document that he had to sign, Becket ultimately split forever. Barons wanted a king that voluntarily consulted magnates for taxes, and nobles wanted to follow leadership of inspiring kings. Let's watch for this pattern, the humbling and humiliating of kings who overstep, and ultimately barons who extract control over them, and then, as we'll see, a backlash over the treatment and concessions of the king, and a swing back in the favor of abusive freedoms of kings. So this is going to be a pattern that we'll see in later English history, and it starts right now. Well, Henry declares himself at 19, though he's still working with the advisors such as de Burgh. The other important development of 1227 was the death of Louis VIII. This left a 12-year-old King Louis IX on the throne. Henry longed to play a role in Europe that would make him the equal of the Emperor Frederick II of Germany and King Louis IX of France. Seeing this as a golden opportunity, in 1230, Henry insists on another invasion of Poitou, which had pledged its support to Henry. This was in an effort ultimately to get to Poitou, not Normandy, as many of Henry's magnates had assumed and ultimately wanted. They were more concerned with winning back Normandy than Poitou. Isabel, Henry's mother, and her husband, Hugh de Lusignan, the Count of Marche, had promised their military support to Henry. But when Henry arrives in Poitou, Henry's army dissolved while he was waiting in vain for Lusignan's support. The invasion as a whole fails, and Henry is forced to return back to England humiliated. In an effort to reassure his magnates, Henry reissued the Magna Carta yet again in 1234. We now move to a period of greater independence, the personal rule of Henry from 1236 to 1258. However, by the end of Henry's rule, 1258, his government had completely fallen apart. We'll consider three factors that contributed to the destruction of his government. This was factionalism, failed wars, and costly concessions, particularly in terms of the debts that he had acquired from these costly concessions. Well, what drove these destructive aspects of Henry's reign? It was a desire to win back Angevin lands, as we've just seen, and also play a role in Europe that was similar to the kings of France and Germany. He wanted to be influential. Henry's desire to play this sort of role in Europe would cause him to attract and receive continental figures to his court who ultimately had a disruptive role. The first was Simon de Montfort, the third son of a leader of the Albigensian Crusade in southern France and a claimant to the English earldom of Leicester. He became a military and diplomatic figure around Henry's court, and he ultimately marries Henry's sister, Eleanor. Importantly, he grew up in France, and he had connections with Capetian nobility and also King Louis IX. Because he held extensive lands there in France in Louis's name, Henry believed that he could make him a figure of European-wide significance. Henry also sought to make connections to Europe by way of marriages. In 1235, Henry married his sister Isabella to the Emperor Frederick II of Germany. That meant that Henry and Frederick became brother-in-laws. A year later, Henry married Eleanor, the second daughter of the Count of Provence. Eleanor's eldest sister, Marguerite, was the wife of King Louis IX of France, and this meant that Henry and Louis now became brother-in-laws. So things seemed to be working well with Henry's plan to attract and acquire connections of European-wide significance. However, these marriages came with other opportunities, but also baggages. Of the Queen's 6 uncles, 5 of them came to have connections with England. These are the Counts of Savoy, the family of Eleanor of Provence's mother. In 1236, William of Savoy, the bishop-elect of Valence, became the king's chief political advisor. Peter of Savoy, the brother of William, also came to England and acquired lands and became one of Henry's most important magnates and advisors. In 1241, another Savoy brother, Boniface of Savoy, was elected Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most significant ecclesiastical positions within England. And so these outsiders acquired significant offices and close advisorships to the king. Henry had half-brothers through his mother's marriage to Hugh of Lusignan. These Lusignan brothers also came to court looking for lands and wanted to make a name for themselves in England. And Henry granted them lands and influences at court, much to the chagrin of local magnates. They were already blamed for the failed attempt to reclaim Poitou in 1230 and 1242. You'll recall there had been two losses, two failed attempts to reclaim Poitou, and the Lusignans have been associated with both of those. Moreover, English nobles perceived them as arrogant and greedy and unscrupulous. Well, why were these courtiers, Simon de Montfort, Counts of Savoy, and also the Lusignans, significant in this story? They were all self-aggrandizing, and they were considered foreigners, taking over lands and wealth from England, though without having England's interests in mind. And all of this upset English barons. As noted with the Lusignans, Henry failed on a number of occasions with to win back Angevin lands through war. Henry was obsessed with regaining Poitou, ostensibly because he imagined that he had help there through his brother and the Lusignans courtiers. But we've already seen this in 1230. Henry de Burgh's invasion of Poitou fails because of lack of Lusignan support. And in 1242, Henry's second invasion fails because of a lack of Lusignan support. The magnates in Parliament denied Henry a war tax to recoup his losses with the second invasion. So how did Henry pay for these? Well, he paid through his own resources. And upon his return in 1243, Wales breaks out in rebellion. Here, too, Parliament denied a war tax for him in order to fight this. So Henry had to pay here through his own resources. Henry also made a series of financial costly concessions. He made expensive promises to pay dowry obligations. So, for example, his sister's dowry of £60,000 to Emperor Frederick II. This was a huge cost that had to be paid. And then also one for his sister Eleanor's dowry to Simon de Montfort. And he had to pay these out of his own resources. He also endowed his Lusignan half-brothers with English lands and revenues. He also provided Edward, his eldest son and heir, with an annual income of £10,000, which is a significant portion of his annual income. The last straw, however, was the debacle that happened in Sicily. Frederick II died in 1250, and the papacy had been engaged in a drawn-out conflict with Frederick over the control of Sicily. The papacy claimed Sicily as a fief. You may recall when we had a discussion of John, who gave England to the papacy as a fief. We had also named Sicily as a territory that was claimed as a fief by the papacy. At this point, Innocent IV barred the Holy Roman Emperor from control because he's in a conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, so he's looking for someone else to take over Sicily. So in 1254, Innocent offers Sicily to Henry III. Henry, in a desire to have increasing European influence, accepts on behalf of his second son, Edmund, who's 10 years old at the time. However, it comes with a challenge. Henry wanted to assume, or Henry was forced to assume, the enormous debts that the papacy had already incurred in campaigns against Frederick's family in Sicily, more than £90,000. But Henry committed to recouping these costs, that is to say, repaying these costs back to the papacy. And what's worse is that Sicily was not Innocent's to give. Sicily was currently held by Frederick II's able but illegitimate son, Manfred. So Henry would have to win Sicily through a costly war. So Henry's now both committed to paying off the papal debts and also paying the cost of an uncertain war to remove Manfred. Henry felt, however, that he could not renege on his debts without embarrassment, and he didn't want to be Europeanly wide embarrassed, if that's a phrase we should use. So Henry falls hopelessly behind in payments, and then the papacy threatens to excommunicate him unless he pays up. Well, Henry will eventually turn to his barons for help, but only after first taxing the Jewish community of England mercilessly. In the 1220s and in 1239, Henry taxed the Jewish communities £1,500 and £2,000 per year. In 1241, for his Poitevin expedition, a massive tax of more than 13,000 pounds was demanded in cash. Remember, this is the one that the Parliament had denied. So, having been denied traditional means of raising money, he turned and taxed the Jews. There were further taxes between 1241 and 1258. We're getting to the end of his rule, a demand of 70,000 pounds. Well, what was the effect? It was to completely devastate the Jewish community and permanently reduce its financial value to the throne. So what we're seeing here is a desire for Henry to have influence, and that means wars. And when he can't get that money through the Parliament, he turns in a greedy way and completely devastates the Jewish community. Well, these large taxation efforts forced Jews to try and call in outstanding debts as a way of creating the cash that was needed for these huge one-off taxations. This looked like selling loans as bonds for a fraction of the price, but to who? Powerful figures at Henry's court, specifically the Savoy and the Lusignan. These were the foreign elements who were looking to try and get a foothold. Well, why purchase these bonds? They did so in hope of acquiring the lands that were guaranteed on default, and they forced debtors to pay in full or demanded the collateral land. Well, who was to blame for these hardships? We can see some of this in our source, persecutions and expulsion of English Jews. The debtors tended to blame the Jews, resulting in a wave of anti-Jewish sentiment, but they also blamed the Lusignan courtiers who profited from the traffic in Jewish bonds. We see a rising anger here at Jews, while at the same time their fortunes decline dramatically. This isn't the death blow of the Jewish community, but we're certainly getting there. We're going to see that later. Well, once the Jewish community was tapped of its resources, Henry turned to the barons for their help in 1258. The barons agreed to help Henry in exchange for radical political concessions, and this will lead to a 7-year period of baronial reforms and rebellion. But why not just tax the barons, since he's king? Well, we can answer that question with another question. Were the clauses requiring the consent of the king's subjects for aid, scutages, or taxes on movables deleted from the 1217 reissue of the Magna Carta? Yes, they were, which we've said. But in practice, Henry never sought to impose such taxations. We're really in a new period here. First, he always asked for their consent. And remember that we saw a precedent earlier under de Burgh, when he demanded 1/4, or rather asked for 1/4 of a taxation on all movables for the first invasion of Poitou. But he did so only with the consent of the nobles. So what we see here is a new relationship that is reciprocal. Barons supply taxation in money in exchange for a redress of grievances. Well, so what? This became the distinguishing feature of constitutional history of England lasting up until the 17th century, this reciprocal relationship of asking for money in a consensual way in exchange for the redress of grievances. So in 1258, Henry meets with the magnates in Parliament at Oxford to try and deal with the matter of the Sicilian debts. They offer to help with the Sicilian debts in exchange for a radical government reform, and these are known as the Provisions of Oxford. This introduces a council of 15 that are meant to offer advice on all matters. They can't be chosen from Henry. And what of the fate of the Lusignans? The Lusignans are exiled from the realm. Also, new appendages are reintroduced into the government in order to bring some justice and stability. The justiciar is brought back in order to offer justice for rich and poor alike. This is the first time since 1234 that a justiciar had been in place. And also the chancellor and the treasurer are brought back in. They are made to swear oaths of allegiance to the king and to the council. The Royal Council meets in Parliament 3 times on a regularly scheduled each year, and they insist that the royal government should be collaborative in a consultative enterprise. The effects of this was to place Henry in a humiliating ward-like state, reminiscent of his minority. Worse still, the king complained that the council sometimes met without him. Henry complained that the council didn't follow his advice, and the councilors responded that they would follow his advice when he, quote, talked sense, end quote. In 1260, the council tried to hold a parliament in the king's absence when Henry had expressly forbade the meeting. What was the result? Well, many rescinded their support for the council, considering this move too radical in terms of their treatment of the king, who was humiliated by this ward-like arrangement. Many had joined the idea of a council in the immediate effect of the Sicilian debt, but ultimately became uncomfortable with dominating the king in this way as the situation continued on. In that year, 1260, the support for the council waned, and Henry formally abolished the provisions of Oxford, and the Pope absolved him of his oath to the provisions. Moreover, the Lusignans returned to England. One of the chief architects of the provisions of Oxford was Simon de Montfort. He departed from England when the provisions were abolished in 1262, fearing for himself. But the following year, however, he returned in the spring of 1263 with a new faction of disaffected magnates who blamed, quote, alien, end quote, influence on the abolition of the provisions. That is to say, the Savoy and the Lusignans. Well, ultimately, they are battled to a stalemate, and the whole matter is submitted to Louis IX of France as a mediator. He gave his ruling in the Mise of Amiens in 1264, which declares as follows: we suppress and annul all aforesaid provisions, ordinances, statutes, and obligations, by whatever name, and all that has followed from them. We also decree and ordain that the said king, of his own will, may freely appoint, dismiss, and remove the justiciar, councillor, treasurer, councillors, lesser justices, sheriffs, and any other officers and administrators of his kingdom and household, as he was used and able to do prior to the time of the aforesaid provisions. So they appealed to the King of France. However, the King of France, Louis, had no desire to introduce a precedent where the power of kings could be judged by magnates. And so he completely dissolves the provisions. Well, what's the result? Henry's opponents, with Simon de Montfort, now take up arms in rebellion. This results in a pitched battle, the Battle of Lewes, and a brief success for the rebels. De Montfort's forces win, though badly outnumbered. Henry III has to submit to the rebels, and Prince Edward is held hostage to ensure the king's cooperation with the new regime. Simon de Montfort is the de facto ruler. It'll only last 15 months, and he rules in the name of the captive king, Henry III. De Montfort, however, begins to enrich himself and his family, taking over territories, which would have been okay for a king, but people considered it wrong for Simon de Montfort. But Edward escapes from prison, and England rallies around him. He raises followers and attacks Simon at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Simon is killed and chopped to pieces. We get an image of this in Matthew Paris's history. This image is worth taking a closer look at. It's drawn on vellum, and as you may know, vellum is animal skin. And this is the side of vellum which is referred to as the hair side. So vellum has, if you think about it as a piece of skin, there's the skin underneath, and then there's the skin where there's hair. So if you look to the right of the image, you can see the pores of the animal, and these are portions that you can see on vellum. So you can see all the various pores to the right side of that image of Simon de Montfort's body all chopped up. Well, this is the end of the baronial government. Henry III resumes the throne. Let's reflect a little bit. This is really a story, today's lecture, of what kings wanted and what barons wanted. Henry wanted to be important, and he failed. And moreover, he seemed to act in a reckless way in an attempt to try and get his influence in Europe and win back the Angevin territories. And this made barons uncomfortable. However, barons wanted an inspiring king, and they were willing to offer Henry some slack. But when things went too far, when debts became too intense, when battles lost, and that meant a waste of money, they clamped down on him. And yet there's eventually a reaction in the other direction, a reaction against the humiliation of a medieval king. And then there's support yet again for the king. The big change in all of this, however, is that the relationship of the king to taxation. Henry never tries to force taxation on the community. In that way, we see the effect of Magna Carta as quite significant. Even when the formal elements of consent are taken out of the Magna Carta, nevertheless, the kings from this point forward will not force taxation. They'll always try to negotiate them through Parliament, and this is really the new revelation of this period. So today we considered the story of Henry and how factionalism, failed war, and costly concessions ultimately led to the provisional government takeover. What new distinguishing feature of constitutional history of England happened during Henry III's reign? That's what we just reflected upon. And then also the treatment of Jews under Henry. Let's end it here.